standing in a corner of a lavish ballroom, staring at scuffed nursing shoes hidden beneath a borrowed gown. Madeline felt entirely invisible. Her husband, Bradley, had just hissed at her to leave through a service elevator before she embarrassed him further. She turned to walk away, choking back tears of humiliation. Bradley remained completely unaware that heavy oak doors across that grand hall were about to swing open. A royal motorcade had arrived outside. A reigning monarch stepped into that exact party, and he looked for exactly one person: Madeline. Her secret father had finally found his missing daughter. Madeline's feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her life. After a grueling 14-hour shift in the pediatric intensive care unit at St. Jude's Memorial, her scrubs clung to her exhausted frame. She was a registered nurse, a vocation she pursued not for prestige, but from a deeply rooted desire to heal. Having grown up bouncing between Seattle foster homes after her mother's tragic passing, Madeline knew what it felt like to be scared and alone. She spent her days holding the tiny hands of frightened children, monitoring vital signs, and whispering words of comfort into the sterile, beeping quiet of the hospital wards. Her husband, Bradley Smith, existed in an entirely different universe. Bradley was a senior partner at Pierce, Donovan and Reed, one of the most ruthless and elite corporate law firms on the West Coast. When they first met in their early 20s, Bradley was a struggling law student, and Madeline was waitressing to pay for nursing school. Back then, their shared ambition had united them. But as Bradley climbed the treacherous rungs of the corporate ladder, his soul seemed to harden, calcifying into something unrecognizable. He traded his easy smile for a permanent, calculating scowl. He traded their cozy weekend mornings for high-stakes golf games with billionaires. When Madeline finally pushed open the heavy mahogany door of their penthouse apartment, the scent of expensive scotch and imported leather greeted her. Bradley was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering skyline, a Bluetooth earpiece glowing softly against his jaw. "I need those contracts finalized by dawn, Grayson," Bradley snapped into the earpiece, his tone dripping with condescension. "I don't care if you have to miss your daughter's recital. Make it happen." He tapped the device, ending the call, and finally turned to look at his wife. His gaze swept over her wrinkled blue scrubs, her messy bun, and the dark circles under her eyes. There was no warmth in his expression, only a mild, weary irritation. "You're late," he noted, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "We had an emergency admission," Madeline replied softly, toeing off her worn sneakers. "A little boy with severe respiratory distress. I couldn't just clock out." "Always the martyr, Maddie," Bradley sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Did you at least pick up my dry cleaning on your way back?" Madeline froze. In the chaos of saving a child's life, the dry cleaning had completely evaporated from her mind. "Bradley, I'm so sorry. I came straight from the ICU." Bradley set his glass down on the marble counter with a sharp clack. "Unbelievable. Truly unbelievable. I have the most important meeting of my career tomorrow, and my wife can't manage a simple errand because she's too busy playing Florence Nightingale for minimum wage." "I save lives, Bradley," she whispered, the familiar sting of tears pricking her eyes. "My job matters." "Your job is charity work," he shot back coldly. "And frankly, it's becoming an embarrassment. My mother was right. You lack the fundamental understanding of what it takes to support a man in my position." His mother, Bianca Smith. A woman whose veins ran with icy propriety and old wealth. Bianca had never forgiven her son for marrying an orphan with no pedigree, no trust fund, and no social standing. At every family gathering, Bianca made a point to ask Madeline if she was still cleaning bedpans, her tone laced with aristocratic venom. Winston, Bradley's father, simply ignored Madeline entirely, treating her like a slightly defective piece of furniture. Madeline retreated to their guest bathroom, locking the door behind her. She turned on the faucet, letting the cold water run over her wrists, trying to steady her breathing. As she looked in the mirror, her hand instinctively reached for the heavy silver locket resting against her collarbone. It was the only thing she owned from her biological mother, a woman who had died of a sudden, severe illness when Madeline was just 18 months old. The foster care system had passed the locket along with her meager file. It was a beautiful, ancient thing, heavy and cold, engraved with a peculiar crest, a rampant lion holding a single, solitary star, encircled by a wreath of oak leaves. Madeline had never been able to trace its origins, but she wore it every single day. It was her anchor, her only proof that she came from somewhere, from someone. She didn't know then that the very same crest was stamped on official state documents, military uniforms, and the royal palace gates of a small, profoundly wealthy European nation thousands of miles away. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the Smith penthouse reached a fever pitch. Pierce, Donovan, and Reed was hosting its 50th anniversary gala. It was not merely a corporate party, it was the social event of the decade. The firm was courting a monumental new client, a European royal family looking to restructure their immense global asset portfolio. Rumors had been flying through the high society circles that King Leopold of Oakhaven, a sovereign state known for its impenetrable banking privacy, lush mountain ranges, and centuries-old monarchy, was personally attending the gala to finalize the deal. Bradley was practically vibrating with nervous ambition. He saw this as his golden ticket to becoming a managing partner. But as the event drew closer, his anxiety began to manifest as outright cruelty toward Madeline. "The dress code is white tie," Bradley announced one evening, tossing a heavy, gold-embossed invitation onto the kitchen island. "Which means you cannot wear anything from a department store. The press will be there. The king will be there. Vanessa Reed and the other partners' wives are wearing custom couture." "I can find something elegant, Bradley," Madeline said, trying to keep her voice even. "I'll go shopping tomorrow." Bradley looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Honestly, Maddie, I'd prefer it if you just sat this one out. You hate these things anyway. You don't know how to talk to these people. You don't understand geopolitical investments or high-yield portfolios. If King Leopold or his entourage speaks to you, you'll just end up talking about sick kids and hospital shifts. It's depressing. It brings the mood down." The words felt like a physical blow. "You want to hide me," she stated, her voice trembling. "You're ashamed of your own wife." "I am protecting my career." Bradley raised his voice, his face flushing with anger. "Everything I have worked for is riding on this weekend. I cannot afford to have you dropping a fork or saying something painfully middle class in front of royalty. Just say you have a migraine, please." But a quiet, stubborn defiance ignited in Madeline's chest. For 7 years, she had shrunk herself to fit into Bradley's world. She had swallowed his mother's insults, tolerated his neglect, and apologized for existing. Not this time. "I am your wife," Madeline said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The invitation says partners and spouses. I am going." Bradley stared at her, an ugly sneer curling his lips. "Fine, but stay out of my way." The next day, Madeline confided in her closest friend and fellow nurse, Fiona. Fiona was a fiery, fiercely loyal woman who despised Bradley and everything he stood for. "He actually told you to stay home," Fiona fumed, shoving a medical chart onto the nurse's station desk. "Maddie, That man is a walking red flag dipped in toxic waste. You are going to that party, and you are going to look breathtaking." Fiona insisted on taking Madeleine to an exclusive vintage boutique run by a friend of hers. After hours of trying on gowns, Madeleine finally stepped out of the dressing room in a dress that made Fiona gasp. It was a vintage 1950s emerald green silk gown, an off-the-shoulder masterpiece that draped perfectly over Madeleine's figure, highlighting her porcelain skin and auburn hair. It didn't look like modern, flashy couture. It looked like timeless, old-world royalty. "You look like a queen," Fiona whispered, her eyes shining. Madeleine smiled shyly, reaching up to adjust the silver locket at her throat. "I don't know." "Is the necklace too bulky for this neckline?" Fiona stepped closer, squinting at the heavy silver piece. "I've always loved that locket. The design is so specific. Have you ever tried reverse searching the crest online?" "A few times," Madeleine admitted, "but it just brings up generic heraldry stuff. It belonged to my mum. I don't feel right taking it off." "Keep it on," Fiona insisted softly. "Let her be at the party with you." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, King Leopold of Oakhaven was boarding his private jet. He was a man of 65, distinguished, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and eyes that held profound, unshakable sorrow. 30 years ago, he had fallen fiercely in love with an American college student studying abroad in Europe. Her name was Clara. They had a secret romance, hidden from the rigid Oakhaven royal court. When Clara became pregnant, Leopold's furious father, the ruling monarch at the time, threatened to destroy Clara's life and family if she didn't disappear. Terrified and wanting to protect her unborn child from a ruthless royal scandal, Clara fled back to America, cutting off all contact. Leopold had spent the last 3 decades searching for her, utilizing private investigators and global intelligence networks. Just a month ago, a breakthrough had occurred. He finally found Clara's death certificate in Washington state. And miraculously, he discovered that she had given birth to a daughter before she died. His daughter. A princess of Oakhaven. The investigators had tracked the daughter down to a coastal city. She was married to an American lawyer. The king's decision to do business with Pierce, Donovan, and Reed wasn't a coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver. He was coming to America to meet the executives, yes, but primarily he was coming to find his little girl. The Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was a spectacle of overwhelming opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a glittering light over hundreds of guests, clad in tuxedos and diamond-draped gowns. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, expensive French perfume, and the low hum of powerful people making million-dollar deals over flutes of Dom Perignon. Madeleine stood near a towering ice sculpture, feeling entirely out of her depth. She clutched a glass of sparkling water, her emerald gown brushing the polished marble floor. Beside her, Bradley was in his element. He was entirely ignoring her, laughing loudly at a joke made by senior partner Donovan while schmoozing a group of Swiss hedge fund managers. Every time Madeleine tried to step closer to her husband, Bradley subtly shifted his shoulder, physically boxing her out of the conversation. "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence," a nasal voice drawled. Madeleine turned to see Vanessa Reed, the wife of the managing partner. Vanessa was dripping in Cartier, her face a mask of perfectly injected condescension. Behind her stood Bradley's mother, Bianca, holding a martini and looking at Madeleine as if she were a rat that had scurried into the ballroom. "Hello, Vanessa. Hello, Bianca," Madeleine said politely, keeping her posture straight. "Emerald green, Madeleine?" Bianca asked, her eyes raking over the vintage dress. "How festive." Did you make it yourself? Or is it a hand-me-down from one of your little patient's mothers?" Vanessa snickered behind her champagne flute. "I suppose it's hard to keep up with current fashion when one is knee-deep in gauze and bodily fluids all day. Tell me, do you ever get the smell of hospital bleach out of your hair?" Madeline's cheeks burned. "My work is very fulfilling, Vanessa, and the dress is vintage." "Vintage?" Bianca repeated the word like it was a disease, a polite word for used. Bradley must be so stressed, carrying the financial and social weight of this marriage all on his own. Before Madeline could defend herself, a waiter carrying a massive silver tray of hors d'oeuvres hurried past. Trying to avoid a sudden backward step from a nearby guest, the waiter swerved, clipping Madeline's shoulder. Madeline stumbled forward, bumping directly into Vanessa. A splash of deep red wine cascaded down the front of Vanessa's white silk couture gown. A collective gasp echoed through their immediate circle. The music seemed to stop. "My dress!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing over the gentle string quartet playing in the background. "You clumsy, stupid girl! Do you have any idea how much this costs?" "I am so sorry," Madeline gasped, immediately grabbing a linen napkin from a passing table and stepping forward to help. "It was an accident. The waiter—" "Don't touch me with your filthy hands!" Vanessa spat, smacking Madeline's hand away. "You are an absolute disaster." The commotion caught Bradley's attention. He turned, excusing himself from the hedge fund managers, and quickly crossed the floor. When he saw Vanessa's ruined dress and his wife standing there with a napkin, his face drained of color, replacing itself with a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Vanessa, I am so incredibly sorry," Bradley groveled immediately, not even asking Madeline what had happened. "We will pay for a replacement. Madeline is incredibly clumsy. I apologize." "Keep her away from me, Bradley," Vanessa hissed, storming off toward the powder room, Bianca following closely behind, throwing a disgusted glare over her shoulder. Bradley spun around, grabbing Madeline's upper arm with a painful, bruising grip. "Bradley, you're hurting me," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "Shut up," he hissed through clenched teeth, his smile remaining plastered on his face for the surrounding onlookers as he forcibly marched her out of the main ballroom. He dragged her past the elegant velvet ropes, down a carpeted hallway, and into a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the kitchen entrance. Once they were hidden from view, he let go of her arm, roughly pushing her back. "You are an absolute catastrophe," Bradley sneered, his voice a lethal, venomous whisper. "I asked you to do one thing. One thing. Stay out of the way. And you managed to assault the managing partner's wife with red wine just minutes before the King of Oakhaven is scheduled to arrive." "I didn't do it! A waiter bumped into me!" Madeline cried, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "I don't care!" Bradley shouted, slamming his fist against the wall next to her head. Madeline flinched, pressing her back against the cool plaster. "You don't belong here. You have never belonged here. You are nothing but a glorified servant who thinks she's a saint because she wipes snot off dying kids. You embarrass me, Madeline. You embarrass my family. You drag me down." The words shattered whatever fragile love Madeline had left for him. The illusion of her marriage completely dissolved, leaving only the ugly, hollow truth. He didn't love her. He despised her. "You want me to leave?" she stated, her voice suddenly devoid of emotion, a cold, protective numbness washing over her. "Yes," Bradley snarled, pointing down the hallway toward a pair of swinging metal doors. "I want you out of my sight. Don't go through the main lobby. The press is out there waiting for the royal motorcade, and you look like a crying, pathetic mess. Take the service elevator down to the kitchen loading dock. Take a taxi. I don't care how you get home. Just get out. I'll deal with you tomorrow." He turned his back on her, straightening his bow tie and marched back toward the golden light of the ballroom, abandoning her in the shadows. Madeline stood alone in the hallway for a long moment. She looked down at her scuffed nursing shoes, which she had worn because her heels gave her blisters. She looked at the heavy silver locket resting against her chest. She had never felt so utterly discarded, so completely worthless. Wiping her tears with the back of her hand, she lifted her chin. She wouldn't cry over him anymore. She turned toward the metal swinging doors, ready to walk down the service hallway and exit through the garbage-loading dock, exactly as she had been ordered. But as her hand pushed against the metal plate of the door, a sudden, deafening silence fell over the adjacent main hall. The gentle string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Through the crack in the door, Madeline heard a booming, authoritative voice echo through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, announcing His Royal Majesty, King Leopold III of Oakhaven." Madeline paused, her hand resting on the service door. Even from the back hallway, she could hear the collective shuffle of hundreds of guests stepping back, making way. Intrigued despite her heartbreak, Madeline let the service door close and walked slowly back to the edge of the hallway, peering around the ornate marble pillar into the main entrance of the ballroom. The heavy, towering oak doors of the grand hall had swung wide open, flanked by 4 massive security guards in dark suits and a royal detail in crisp ceremonial uniforms stood King Leopold. He was an imposing figure, radiating power and an undeniable quiet dignity. Bradley, standing near the front of the crowd alongside the senior partners, puffed out his chest, stepping forward to offer his hand, his face stretched into a sycophantic grin. But the king didn't look at Bradley. He didn't look at the managing partners. He didn't look at the extravagant ice sculpture or the flowing champagne. King Leopold stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes, sharp and intense, swept over the crowd. He was scanning the room, searching for something, for someone. And then his gaze pierced through the crowd, past the dazzling jewels and tailored suits, and locked directly onto the dimly lit hallway where Madeline stood, half hidden in the shadows, her emerald dress catching the light. Or rather, his eyes locked onto the heavy silver locket resting against her chest. The king's breath hitched. He completely ignored Bradley's outstretched hand, pushing past the stunned lawyers as if they were mere ghosts, and began walking straight toward the hallway, toward Madeline. Bradley Smith stood frozen, his outstretched hand hovering awkwardly in the empty air. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. The king had entirely dismissed him, treating a senior partner at Pierce, Donovan, and Reed as if he were nothing more than a coat rack. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted bitter on Bradley's tongue. He watched, horrified, as the king's trajectory pointed directly toward the dimly lit alcove near the kitchen doors. He was walking toward Madeline. No, Bradley thought, his mind racing to rationalize the impossible. He must be looking for the private restrooms. Or maybe he's offended by her standing there in that cheap vintage dress. Desperation overrode Bradley's usually calculating demeanor. He could not let this awkward, embarrassing woman ruin his pivotal career moment. He darted forward, breaking the unspoken perimeter, attempting to intercept the king before he reached the service hallway. "Your Royal Majesty, please forgive the intrusion," Bradley stammered, his voice unnaturally high and slick with manufactured charm. He stepped neatly into the king's path, blocking Leopold's line of sight to Madeline. "I am Bradley Smith, the lead counsel for your portfolio restructuring. The VIP lounge is actually situated in the East Wing. The woman standing back there she was just leaving. My apologies for the disruption. The service staff often lose their way." King Leopold halted. He did not look at Bradley's face. He looked at Bradley's chest, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute, terrifying authority. "Move," the king commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried a baritone weight that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Your Majesty, I assure you," Bradley began, his sycophantic smile wavering. Before Bradley could finish his sentence, Commander Brooks stepped forward. With a swift, heavily practiced motion, the massive guard placed a firm, immovable hand on Bradley's shoulder and physically shoved the lawyer aside. Bradley stumbled in his expensive Italian loafers, barely catching his balance against a decorative marble pillar. He looked up, utterly humiliated, as a collective gasp rippled through the crowd of his peers. Bianca Smith, watching from the edge of the crowd, clutched her pearl necklace, her face draining of color. Leopold stepped into the shadows of the alcove. Madeline stood absolutely still. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, trapped in the cage of her chest. She instinctively crossed her arms over her stomach, a defensive posture honed from years of feeling inadequate in these rooms. She watched the towering figure of the monarch stop barely 3 feet in front of her. Up close, the lines on his face told a story of profound grief and weary leadership. The king did not speak at first. He simply stared. His piercing blue eyes traced the slope of her cheekbones, the auburn hue of her hair, and finally, they locked onto the heavy silver locket resting against her collarbone. A trembling hand reached out from the cuff of the king's ceremonial jacket. Leopold gently pointed a single finger toward the silver jewelry. "Where did you get that?" the king asked, his voice suddenly fragile, cracking under the weight of a 30-year search. Madeline swallowed hard, her throat dry. She could feel the eyes of every single person in the ballroom burning into her back. It belonged to my mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring in her ears. "I've had it since I was placed in the foster system." Leopold's breath hitched. The stern, imposing monarch seemed to crumble inward for a fraction of a second, his shoulders dropping as if an immense physical weight had been lifted from them. "The crest," he murmured, taking a half-step closer. A rampant lion holding a solitary star, encircled by a wreath of oak leaves, the private seal of the House of Oakhaven. I gave that to her on a rainy Tuesday in Geneva, in a small cafe near the university. Madeline's eyes widened. You knew my mother? You knew Clara? Knew her?" A single, shining tear escaped the corner of the king's eye, catching the dim light of the hallway. He did not bother to wipe it away. "Madeline, I loved her. She was the absolute light of my life. When she disappeared, she took my heart across the ocean with her. I have spent every waking moment of my reign searching for her, and for the child I found out she carried." The ballroom behind them was dead silent. Even the ice sculptures seemed to be listening. Leopold looked deeply into Madeline's eyes. "You have her eyes, the exact same shade of defiance and kindness. You have her spirit. Madeline, I am your father." The words hit Madeleine with the force of a physical blow. The room spun wildly. The pediatric ward, the worn scrubs, the cramped foster homes, the endless nights of wondering why she was abandoned, all of it collided with the reality of the man standing before her. She was not a mistake. She was not discarded. She was searched for. She was wanted. "My father," she repeated, the word feeling alien and heavy on her tongue. Her hand flew to her mouth as a sob tore its way out of her chest. Leopold closed the distance between them. Without hesitation, disregarding every rule of royal protocol and public decorum, the King of Oakhaven wrapped his arms around the crying nurse in the emerald vintage dress, holding her as tightly as a father holding a lost child. Madeline buried her face in the gold braiding of his uniform, decades of repressed grief and loneliness finally shattering into a million pieces. The tender moment lasted only a minute, but to the onlookers, it felt like an hour. When Leopold finally pulled back, he kept his hands firmly on Madeline's shoulders, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. "You will never be alone again," Leopold promised, his voice filled with fierce, paternal resolve. "You are Princess Madeline of Oakhaven, and you are coming home." Suddenly, the frantic sound of footsteps broke the spell. Bradley Smith, his face pale and slick with panic, pushed past the edge of the Royal Guard, his mind desperately trying to salvage the situation. His brain was misfiring, unable to reconcile the fact that his embarrassing wife was the heir to a European fortune. "Madeline! Darling!" Bradley exclaimed, forcing a hysterical laugh as he approached them. "What a misunderstanding. Your Majesty, this is incredible. This is my wife, Madeline Smith. I am her husband. We are overwhelmed with joy. Let me take her to the VIP suite so she can compose herself. We have so much to discuss regarding the portfolio now that we are practically family." Madeline stiffened. The sound of Bradley's voice, the same voice that had just berated her, belittled her, and ordered her out like garbage, sent a jolt of ice water through her veins. The protective numbness that had settled over her earlier completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, blazing clarity. King Leopold felt Madeline tense under his hands. He slowly turned his head to look at Bradley. The warmth in the monarch's eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial, terrifying darkness. "Your wife," Leopold repeated, the words sounding like a death sentence. He looked down at Madeline. "Is this the man who caused you to cry? The man you were hiding from in this hallway?" Madeline looked at Bradley. She saw the pathetic desperation in his eyes. She looked past him and saw Bianca and Vanessa standing in the crowd, their jaws practically on the floor, their expressions a mixture of horror and profound dread. For 7 years, Madeline had protected Bradley's reputation. She had hidden his cruelty behind closed doors to preserve his image. She was done protecting him. "He wasn't comforting me, if that's what you're asking," Madeline said, her voice remarkably clear and steady. It echoed perfectly through the silent ballroom. "He dragged me into this hallway because someone bumped into me, and a drink spilled on the managing partner's wife. He told me I was a disaster. He told me I was an embarrassment to his family." Bradley let out a strangled gasp. "Madeline, sweetheart, you're confused. You're emotional. I am perfectly lucid." Madeline cut him off, her spine straightening. She looked directly into her father's eyes. "He ordered me to leave the party. He told me to sneak out through the kitchen service elevator and take a taxi home so I wouldn't ruin his chances of securing your business." A collective, horrified murmur erupted from the crowd. Managing partner Donovan, standing nearby, buried his face in his hands. It was the sound of a multi-million-dollar deal imploding in real time. King Leopold slowly let go of Madeline and turned fully to face Bradley. The air around the monarch seemed to drop 10 degrees. Commander Brooks and the rest of the security detail instinctively stepped closer, their hands resting near their waistbands, sensing their sovereign's rising wrath. "You ordered a Princess of Oakhaven to leave through a garbage dock," Leopold stated. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. "Your Majesty, I didn't know," Bradley pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I swear to you, I had no idea about her lineage. If I had known, I would have treated her like a queen." "And that," Leopold said, his voice dripping with lethal disgust, "is exactly the measure of your character, Mr. Smith. A man who only respects those with power is a man with no honor at all. You treated my daughter like dirt because you thought she was defenseless. You thought she had no one to stand up for her." Leopold turned his gaze to the crowd, locking eyes with the horrified managing partner, Donovan. "Mr. Donovan," the king's voice boomed across the ballroom, "the Oakhaven Sovereign Wealth Fund will not be doing business with Pierce, Donovan, and Reed. Not today. Not ever. I will not entrust a single cent of my nation's prosperity to a firm that employs a man of such profound moral bankruptcy." Donovan turned completely ashen. He looked at Bradley, his eyes filled with professional murder. "Your Majesty, please," Donovan practically begged. "Bradley Smith does not represent the values of this firm. Effective immediately, he is no longer a partner here. He is fired." Bradley staggered back as if he had been physically struck. "Donovan, you can't do that. I brought in the Peterson account. I've given my life to this firm." "You've cost us the biggest client in our history," Donovan hissed, stepping forward. "Get out of my sight, Smith. Security will pack up your office tomorrow." Bradley turned back to Madeline, his eyes wild, tears of sheer panic streaming down his face. He fell to his knees on the polished marble floor, grabbing the hem of her emerald gown. "Maddie, please, you have to fix this. Tell them you forgive me. We're married. We're a team." Madeline looked down at the man she had loved, the man who had systematically destroyed her self-worth for almost a decade. She felt nothing but a cold, heavy pity. She gently pulled the fabric of her dress from his trembling hands. "We haven't been a team in a very long time, Bradley," Madeline said softly. "I'll have my lawyers contact you." She turned away from him, looking up at King Leopold. A gentle, proud smile touched the monarch's lips. He offered his arm to her. "Shall we, my dear?" Leopold asked, his voice filled with a warmth that completely contrasted the ice he had just shown the room. "I believe my jet is waiting on the tarmac. Oakhaven is beautiful this time of year, and the palace staff has been preparing a suite for you for 30 years. Madeline slipped her arm through her father's. "I'd like that very much." Together, the king and his newfound daughter walked out of the service hallway and directly through the center of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elite socialites, billionaires, and powerful lawyers parted like the Red Sea. Vanessa Reed pressed herself against a pillar, refusing to make eye contact, while Bianca Smith looked as though she might faint, her aristocratic pride shattered into dust. As they approached the towering oak doors of the Waldorf Astoria, the flashes of paparazzi cameras from the street outside illuminated the foyer like lightning. Madeline didn't flinch. She adjusted the silver locket at her throat, lifted her chin, and stepped out of the velvet trap of her old life, walking straight into the blinding light of a royal future. Behind her, left in the devastating silence of the grand ballroom, Bradley Smith remained on his knees, surrounded by the ruins of his ambition, finally realizing that the woman he had treated like a servant was the only real royalty he would ever meet. The transition from the suffocating, hostile air of the Waldorf Astoria to the hushed, velvet-lined interior of King Leopold's private Boeing 747 was nothing short of staggering. Madeline sat in a plush, cream-colored leather seat, her scuffed white nursing shoes finally hidden beneath a cashmere blanket a flight attendant had gently draped over her lap. Across the mahogany table, her father, a word that still sent a shock wave of disbelief through her chest, watched her with a mixture of profound relief and quiet sorrow. The aircraft leveled out over the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the glittering, jagged skyline of New York far behind. With it went Bradley Smith, his suffocating mother Bianca, and the 7 years of psychological torment Madeline had endured. "I know this is entirely overwhelming, Madeline," King Leopold said softly, setting aside a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and withdrew a small, worn leather journal, placing it delicately on the table between them. "I wanted to give this to you as soon as we were alone. My private intelligence team retrieved it from a safety deposit box in Seattle, registered under an alias your mother used." Madeline's breath caught. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the cracked leather binding. "My mother's diary?" "Clara was terrified of my father," Leopold explained, his voice thick with an ancient, unresolved grief. "The previous king was a ruthless man who believed the purity of the Oakhaven bloodline was paramount. When he discovered Clara was pregnant, he threatened to have her permanently silenced to avoid a scandal. She fled to America, changed her name, and vanished to protect you. She traded a life of European royalty for a life of hiding, all out of a mother's fierce love. She died of an aggressive autoimmune disorder when you were a toddler, simply because she was too afraid to go to a major hospital, fearing my father's operatives would flag her identity." Tears pricked Madelina's eyes as she opened the brittle pages. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and filled with entries detailing a mother's adoration for her baby girl, alongside her heartbreak over leaving Leopold behind. It was the missing piece of her soul, a tangible proof that she was born not from abandonment, but from an immense, sacrificial love. "She loved you," Madeline whispered, reading a passage where Clara described Leopold's eyes. "And I loved her," the king replied, his gaze unwavering. "And I swear to you on the crown of Oakhaven, Madeline, no one will ever make you feel small, frightened, or unworthy again. Not a husband, not a society. No one. No. When the jet finally touched down on the private tarmac of Aarburg, the capital city of Oakhaven, the sun was just beginning to rise over the snow-capped peaks of the surrounding Alps. The air was crisp, tasting of pine and high-altitude purity. A fleet of sleek, black armored vehicles awaited them, flanked by the Royal Guard. As the motorcade wound its way through the cobblestone streets of the historic city, Madeline stared out the tinted windows. The citizens of Oakhaven were already lining the boulevards. News of the king finding his lost heir had broken globally hours ago, dominating every major news network, from CNN to the BBC. Banners bearing the crest of the rampant lion, the exact crest resting heavily against Madeline's collarbone, were being draped from wrought-iron balconies. They arrived at the gates of Schloss Aarburg, a breathtaking, centuries-old limestone palace that overlooked the capital. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, modern penthouse she had shared with Bradley. This place felt ancient, grounded, and alive with history. However, entering a royal court was not without its own brand of poison. Within 48 hours, the initial euphoria of the reunion settled into the cold reality of aristocratic politics. The House of Oakhaven had not had a direct heir in decades, and many distant relatives had positioned themselves to inherit the throne. Chief among them was Duchess Genevieve of the Northern Province, a formidable, sharp-tongued woman who viewed Madeline not as a miraculous return, but as a severe threat. During Madeline's first official state dinner, held in the grand dining hall beneath vaulted ceilings painted with Renaissance frescoes, Duchess Genevieve made her opening move. "We are, of course, thrilled by your miraculous appearance. Princess Madeline," Genevieve purred, her diamond necklace flashing under the chandeliers. She swirled her wine, her eyes performing a calculated dissection of Madeline. Though one must wonder how a medical assistant from the American working class will adapt to the geopolitical complexities of leading a sovereign nation. Tell me, do they teach macroeconomic policy in nursing school, or just how to administer sponge baths? The table of 50 nobles fell dead silent. King Leopold's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to intervene, but Madeline subtly placed a hand on his forearm. She had spent 7 years shrinking under the insults of Bianca Smith and Vanessa Reed. She was done shrinking. "I am a registered nurse, Duchess Genevieve," Madeline said, her voice carrying the calm, authoritative tone she used during code blues in the ICU. "Which means I am trained to remain entirely calm in high-pressure situations, to diagnose complex systemic failures, and to prioritize the survival of the vulnerable above all else. I have held the hands of grieving parents, and I have brought children back from the brink of death. I understand the fragility of human life, which is the foundation of any functioning society. Macroeconomics can be learned in a boardroom. Empathy, resilience, and grace under fire cannot." A faint murmur of approval rippled down the long mahogany table. Commander Brooks, standing guard by the doors, allowed a rare, approving smirk to cross his stoic face. Duchess Genevieve's smile tightened into a thin, furious line, but she said nothing more. Later that night, sitting in her opulent private suite, Madeline received a secure video call from her best friend, Fiona. "Maddie, it is an absolute circus here," Fiona laughed, her face appearing on the encrypted tablet Leopold had provided. "You're on the cover of every magazine. And Bradley? Oh, you are going to love this. Pierce, Donovan, and Reed not only fired him, but they blacklisted him. He tried to get a job at a boutique firm in Manhattan, and they laughed him out of the lobby. He's currently operating out of a strip mall office in New Jersey, trying to handle traffic tickets." A genuine smile broke across Madeline's face. "I'd feel sorry for him if he hadn't spent years trying to convince me I was nothing." "He just filed a massive lawsuit in the New York State Supreme Court," Fiona added, her tone turning slightly serious. "He's suing for spousal maintenance and half of your royal estate, claiming he supported you through the marriage." Madeline sighed, rubbing her temples. "Of course he is. He's like a parasite that won't detach." But Madeline didn't need to worry about Bradley's pathetic legal maneuvers. The next morning, the terrifyingly efficient legal machinery of the Oakhaven Crown, spearheaded by the international law firm Vanderbilt and Associates, descended upon Bradley's laughable lawsuit. They cited diplomatic immunity, sovereign wealth protections, and presented a mountain of documented evidence detailing his financial abuse and emotional cruelty, meticulously gathered by the King's intelligence officers. Bradley was forced to drop the suit within 48 hours, facing countercharges of extortion that would financially ruin him for the rest of his miserable life. The divorce was expedited and finalized by royal decree. Madeline was finally entirely free. Despite her swift victory over the Duchess's insults and Bradley's legal threats, Madeline struggled with her new reality. She was surrounded by priceless art, armies of staff, and endless wealth. But her hands felt empty. She missed the chaotic rhythm of St. Jude's. She missed the purpose of healing. A month into her residency at the palace, the defining moment of her new life arrived, entirely unannounced. King Leopold was hosting a summit for European trade ministers in the palace's glass conservatory. Madeline was in attendance, wearing a tailored navy blue suit that perfectly balanced royal elegance with her own practical style. The heavy silver locket rested prominently over her blouse. Midway through a speech by the French minister, King Leopold suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His hand flew to his chest, gripping the fabric of his uniform. His face drained of color, turning a terrifying shade of ashen gray. He staggered backward, knocking over a crystal pitcher of water before collapsing entirely to the marble floor. Chaos erupted. Trade ministers shouted, security guards rushed forward, and the room descended into sheer panic. "Stand back!" Commander Brooks roared, trying to clear a path as the king gasped for air, his eyes rolling back. "Get the royal physicians, now!" But the royal physicians were in the medical wing, on the other side of the massive palace grounds. It would take them at least 4 minutes to arrive. In a cardiac event, 4 minutes was a lifetime. Madeleine didn't freeze. The transition was instantaneous. She was no longer a newly minted princess. She was an ICU nurse, and a patient was crashing. She shoved past the French minister, dropping to her knees on the hard marble beside her father. She pressed her fingers firmly against his carotid artery. The pulse was thready, erratic, and fading fast. His lips were turning blue. "He's in ventricular fibrillation," Madeleine shouted, her voice cutting through the panic with clinical authority. "Brooks, does the security detail carry an AED?" "Yes, Your Highness," Brooks yelled, snapping his fingers at a subordinate who immediately unclipped a red automated external defibrillator from his tactical belt and slid it across the floor. Madeleine tore open her father's crisp white shirt, sending gold buttons clattering across the marble. She applied the sticky pads with practiced, lightning-fast precision to his upper right chest and lower left ribcage. "Analyzing rhythm," the machine's robotic voice echoed through the terrified silence of the conservatory. "Shock advised. Charging." "Everyone stand clear," Madeleine commanded, sweeping her arm out to ensure no one was touching the king. She waited for the sharp, high-pitched whine of the capacitor to peak. "Shocking!" She pressed the flashing button. The king's body jolted off the floor. Madeleine immediately linked her hands together, positioned them over the lower half of his sternum, and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. She locked her elbows, using her upper body weight, falling into the exhausting, rhythmic, physical labor of forcing a human heart to pump blood. Duchess Genevieve stood at the edge of the crowd, a hand clamped over her mouth in sheer horror, watching the commoner fight a literal battle against death. "Come on, Dad," Madeleine gritted through her teeth, sweat beading on her forehead as she continued the compressions. "You didn't search for me for 30 years just to leave me now. Come back to me." After 2 agonizing minutes of CPR, the king suddenly gasped, a harsh, rattling intake of air. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. A strong, steady sinus rhythm returned to his chest. The royal physicians finally burst through the conservatory doors, carrying emergency medical bags, but they froze when they saw the scene. The Princess of Oakhaven, her hair messy and her suit wrinkled, was kneeling over the sovereign, holding his hand, having already saved his life. The chief physician rushed forward, quickly checking the king's vitals. He looked up at Madeleine, his eyes wide with absolute reverence. "Your Highness, you stabilized him perfectly. You saved the king." A profound, stunned silence hung over the conservatory, eventually broken by a slow, deliberate clapping. Madeleine looked up to see Duchess Genevieve stepping forward. The hostility in the older woman's eyes had vanished, replaced by a deep, unwavering respect. Soon, the entire room of foreign ministers, security guards, and nobles joined in, a thunderous applause for the woman who had proven her royalty, not through bloodline, but through action. King Leopold was transported to the Royal Oakhaven Medical Center and made a full recovery within weeks. The cardiac event was attributed to a previously undetected arterial blockage, which was swiftly repaired. The incident fundamentally shifted Madeleine's role in Oakhaven. She realized she did not have to choose between the crown and the stethoscope. She could wield the immense power and wealth of her title to amplify her calling. 6 months later, Princess Madeleine stood before a massive crowd in the center of Arburg, the crisp mountain wind tugging at the hem of her emerald coat. Beside her stood King Leopold, looking healthier and prouder than ever. Behind them rose the gleaming, state-of-the-art glass facade of the newly constructed Clara Foundation Pediatric Hospital, fully funded by the Royal Treasury and spearheaded by Madeleine herself. She had found her true place. She wasn't just a figurehead in a tiara. She was a sovereign who healed. The scars of her past, the cruelty of Bradley Smith, the endless shifts in worn-out scrubs, the crushing loneliness of the foster system, had not broken her. They had forged her into a ruler of profound empathy and unbreakable strength. As Madeline raised a pair of golden scissors to cut the ceremonial ribbon, the heavy silver locket gleamed brightly in the Oakhaven sun, a testament to a mother's sacrifice, a father's enduring love, and a daughter who finally found her way home.